So I think it's recording now.
Okay.
So welcome everybody to this symposium for frontline workers. And what we're talking about today is how frontline workers can be effective working with patients or clients who are experiencing abuse in their intimate partner relationships. So first of all, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Kate Tompkins. I'm a therapist in Nova Scotia. I'm also an adult educator, and I have been both for about 50 years. One of the things that I did in my career most frequently was to teach basic counseling skills to frontline workers. So this is an area that's near and dear to my heart, and one that I'm sure that I will continue to be involved in for a long time. And I'd like to welcome today two resource people. Pam Rubin is a feminist lawyer, and she's a therapist who specializes in helping women recover from trauma, particularly sexual trauma. And she has a practice in Nova Scotia. And Christina Baxter is a retired chaplain who started off her career as a flight attendant. And then after she was injured in the air, were you in the air when you were injured?
Yeah. Turbulence.
Yes, she went back to school, and I think that being a flight attendant paid her way through university.
Mm-hmm.
And she went back to school and became a board licensed chaplain. So welcome both.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
let's start off here. Christina, can you tell me about some of the work that you've done in your career as a chaplain? What do chaplains do?
I call what we do accompaniment. In other words, we meet our patient, we walk alongside them, we give them space and time to open up and talk about what's going on with them. So for us, oftentimes we only get one shot at dealing with this person. If they're in the ED and they're going to be discharged, we're going to have just the one visit. There are a few units where you might have multiple visits with the patient. So it's really important for chaplains to be able to recognize red flags and to know what those red flags are saying, so that before discharge, they can bring in the unit's social worker to then unpack what's going on. They're usually the ones that would then work with the discharge planners to make sure that it's a safe discharge. And we're all mandated reporters in the States, so then we would also be filling out a report for the authorities. Some places in the States now allow the police officer to level the charges. They don't rely on the victim they don't put the victim in that position, because recognizing how hard that is. But mostly as a chaplain, we're the one that really has the time and space to just sit with the patient. We have no agenda except what the patient brings to the visit. So right. That's the one critical factor that we have going for us. So, yeah.
So would you call the work that you do therapy, or is it something different?
Well, in Canada, I know in Ontario, chaplains are actually licensed through the Psychotherapy Association. So there, I'm sure they have a lot more counseling responsibilities. In the States, they try to keep a border up between what social workers would do and what a chaplain would do. So I found that there's a therapeutic component in the fact that you listen. Sometimes we're the only person that has the time to sit and just let them unload, right. Inviting them to do that. And there can be a certain therapeutic benefit to that, because how often does someone really deeply listen to us, not judging us, not trying to fix what's wrong with us, just every so often reflecting back what you've heard to give them a chance to correct if you misheard something. And that can bring some relief. Just, that, okay, I've really been heard. Mm-hmm. That can help open that door. And then when the social worker follows up, or the psychologist, it can be very helpful. Okay. So I guess, yeah, there's a therapeutic benefit, but it's in the States, it would not be considered therapy per se.
But it sounds like you do lots of referral to
Yeah.
other people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. We do, it's a team approach, at least in my hospital. And so I always had access to other people. And I know our neuropsychologist in the unit where I worked was really great, helping me work with some of the more interesting patients. Yeah, he could give a lot of insight.
Excellent. Thanks.
Mhm.
Pam, could you tell us about some of the work that you have done with women?
Yeah, thanks. I have been looking at the issue of violence against women for a very, very long time, since a teenager and coming from a violent family of origin. And I professionally pursued a law degree and ended up becoming an evaluator of justice programming. So innovative courts, restorative justice mediation programs, court reform, prosecution and investigatory strategies. I looked at many of these programs through the lens of the experiences of women who were targeted for abuse, mainly by intimate partners. And I did that for quite a number of years as a lawyer, but I ended up feeling like I wanted to be of more direct benefit rather than just doing the policy work, because I had learned so much about women's experiences in the aftermath of violence. And I went back to school in my late 40s and got a master's degree to support counseling work. And that's what I do now. I have a private practice, and I also practice offering free therapy for sexualized trauma survivors in a rural area in Nova Scotia.
Okay, thank you. So you have a very interesting perspective, having two, what some people would think would be completely different kinds of careers coming together into one package. So I'll bet you see things differently than I would or than Christina does. Like, for example, if a woman comes, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, go ahead with your example.
Well, I was just thinking, like, supposing a woman comes to see you and she is a victim of suppose assault, and she doesn't know anything about what kinds of legal protections are available to her and how effective they might be. What would you tell her?
Yeah. Well, I always like to give options to women who are seeking support. And I would lay out what those options are in Canada and in our province of Nova Scotia as clearly as I could. I am very honest and direct about how much help or protection that people can expect from systems, because we know from research that 50% approximately of people will feel more helped than harmed, but about 50% will also feel more harmed than helped by reporting and going on a journey through the legal system. So I just lay out those options, reporting and giving a statement to kick off an investigation as one option, giving a statement to police that they can hold as information, that is not necessarily to pursue charges, but down the line, if there are other victims, or if there is a change of heart and wanting to pursue charges, then the targeted person could activate that information that they've given. To not report to the legal system is another option that the majority of targeted people choose, and often for very good reasons. And so I'd lay out those kind of options and talk about them, talk a little bit about the process and what could be expected. offer the option of having a support person go with her, because the organization that I work for can offer that. And that's very important, often in terms of what women's experience will be like in the justice system, to have a person with them. Research tells us, and anecdotally, I know that people will have better experiences if they're accompanied through that system. And I would talk about it very matter of factly with people without urging any particular choice, and simply say, I support whatever choice you make. This is a very personal decision. You're the expert on your own life, and just allow that kind of space.
Okay, thank you. So it's a complex issue. My guess is, though, that your average frontline worker, so I'm talking here about someone like who's a union rep or a social worker, a nurse, perhaps a shelter worker, perhaps drug and alcohol counselors, people like that, who are often the first person to whom, or ministers, priests, chaplains, pastors, are often the first person to whom a woman would open up and confess what's really happening. How much of that does a frontline worker actually need to know? What is a frontline worker's role when it comes to talking about legal protections?
Well, as a hospital chaplain, that would be out of my, as they say, scope of practice. So my suggestion would be to talk to the social worker about that, because they would then, talk about your legal rights. So yeah, my hands would be kind of tied, because as a chaplain, I actually work for the institution, the hospital. So I have to be really careful what I say, because I'm also their representative too. So yeah, my hands would, I think, pretty much be tied about talking about anything legal. I think that would be more under the social work purview.
Okay.
And what I would offer about that is, unless legal information is part of your professional expertise, I would simply make a referral to somebody else who does have that expertise, and simply give the message, this is not your fault. This is 100% the responsibility of the person who's chosen to abuse.
Yeah.
And that's an extremely important message. And then after that, for more expert information, I would refer to, as Christina said, a local social worker or transition house or women's organization dealing with violence.
Okay.
Can I
Thank you.
just comment on something that Pam said? I think the message, it's 100% the fault of the person who chose to abuse, is a message that doesn't get out there much in from what I've noticed. And I really think that's an important message to start bringing to people. And I'm sure some of these victims of abuse are going to have to hear it many, many times, because it's so new. They've been, what's the word I want? They've been indoctrinated to think it's their fault. That's what the abuser says. You made me do this. Well, not really, but and you hear that lie enough, the old saying, you tell a lie often enough, somebody's going to believe it. So you're having to start a new narrative, to form a new pathway in the brain and a new dialogue in the brain for the, in my case, a patient, your case, your client, that says, no, it's not my fault. It's 100% their fault. Put the responsibility on them where it belongs. So I think that's an important message to get out.
What would you say are the barriers for a woman to actually hear that and take it inside and accept it as being true?
Well, in my case, in the hospital, if the abuse was bad enough to warrant a visit to the hospital, they're probably in shock. Emotional shock is maybe possibly even physical shock. They're in pain, they're injured. Depending on how many times you've been to a hospital, hospitals can be very frightening places. You're out of control. Everybody else is telling you what to do and how to do it. And some of the stuff they're doing to you hurts. So that right there is going to be a barrier. Now, if they stay long enough that we can get the pain under control, get them settled down. Now they might be in a place, if they feel safe enough, to start hearing a new message. And it would be nice to educate staff so that everyone that comes in that gets the opportunity in the course of their treatment to reiterate that message would be really helpful, because they would hear it from a number of different people, maybe in a slightly different way, but that's more opportunities that that message would be heard. And I look at it as planting a seed, because as we know, women often take numerous tries before they successfully leave. So you've got to plant the seed, and then you got to water it and let it grow.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I would affirm all that. And also reemphasize what Christina said earlier, that the society is kind of brainwashing all of us, and perhaps our family of origin, and the abuser themselves is repeating and hammering home this message that the abuse is the fault of the target. You know, what did you do to make them mad? Right? That's the classic question, which still gets asked, you know?
Yeah.
So really challenging that is so important, those internalized messages, the societal messages, and kind of rooting that out of ourselves as professionals. And I think it can really help to think in detail about a number of things. One is the number of choices that an abuser makes going down the road, targeting someone for abuse. And when you really look at it, they're making choice after choice after choice after choice, usually over a fairly long period of time, to abuse and to continue abusing. And a kind of graphic example I used to help pull someone out of that mentality about themselves, who had been sexually assaulted when she fell asleep around somebody who then assaulted her. She was self-blaming. I should have known better than to, you know, fall asleep after the party on the couch. And I said, well, you know, if somebody had come up and assaulted you, stabbed you with a weapon, instead of it being a sexual assault, you know, would you still be self-blaming in this way? And it really shocked them. Oh, no, I wouldn't. That this is a special kind of internalized self-blame that's usually reserved for partner violence or sexualized violence. So just really looking at that stigma, which has been used to silence the targets for many centuries, and also looking at sort of the myths around self-blame and how specific they are to partner violence and to sexual violence, and looking at the choices that abusers make over time. All those things can help us get rid of our own internalized biases around this.
One of the things I've encountered too that can help to complicate matters for women. I mean, some women will actually participate in the violence to a certain extent. Like sometimes they will provoke a violent attack at a time and place where they think that they might be a little bit safer. They might have a little bit more control over the situation. They might poke and poke and poke and poke and poke until he explodes, so that she can have it happen at a time where she can have some control over it. And that seems to produce a great deal of guilt afterwards. And that certainly makes things a lot more complicated.
For her personal healing, for sure. And, you know, the justice system, to an extent where there's mutual violence, has looked at still what are the dynamics of that relationship, what's the power balance of that relationship. So they will do, ideally in more modern jurisdictions with the resources and the training, investigators, law enforcement will look at the question, who is the dominant aggressor? So from a legal point of view, they're looking at factors of, you know, who's living in fear, who has a history of ongoing violence and coercive control, who has and uses weapons, et cetera, down, a line of objective and subjective questions to ask to determine really who over the long term is the dominant aggressor. And in situations where there is mutual violence, investigators should apply that dominant aggressor analysis and only charge the dominant aggressor.
So in your experience, is that how it actually works?
There's not been a lot of investment in expertise around dominant aggressor analysis. There hasn't been a lot of investment in expertise on gendered violence, period, right? And there's still a lot of myths and misconceptions. So, it's not a consistent response from law enforcement in the province of Nova Scotia, and I don't think that many other places.
Well, if the violence is happening to women, that kind of explains why right there. Women are still an expendable commodity in our society. So not everyone who's, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think another thing that needs to be spoken out loud is the cycle of violence. Because I think when you're in an environment where it's ongoing, you lose sight of the fact that there really is a cycle to this. There's the honeymoon phase, then the buildup, then the abusive episode, followed again by the honeymoon stage. And so it's easy to get sucked in that honeymoon phase. Oh, this time he means it. He'll never hit me again, whatever. And I think if we can talk about this and verbalize it, and bring it to and have the victim help us unpack the cyclical episodes to understand that this is part of that pattern of violence. And just because you happen to be in a honeymoon phase for a while, it's not changed. He is still making these same choices to be abusive, but to make that really bring that to the forefront so that they're not sucked in and get a false sense of security going forward.
Yeah, that connects up also to something you had talked about in one of your videos, Kate, and thank you for bringing up the cycle of violence, Christina, because Kate, I remember you talking about this issue about how some of us will provoke the violence because it's that time in the cycle, right? The tension is building and there's leading up to another violent incident. And we as targets want to control that to be at a like the least impactful time for us, right? So it's having a slight measure of control or management of the violence or the violent person. And I think when you combine an awareness of that, trying to get a little bit of control in this situation that's totally out of control, and combine it with the awareness of cycle of violence, talking to women in that way can help reduce the self-blame we might be carrying for trying to stay as safe as possible by controlling the timing of the violence.
Now, not everyone who's watching this video will have experience working with this clientele. So I think it might be interesting to hear from each of you. Of course, we can't use any names because confidentiality is a big deal for all of us, but can you describe a couple of scenarios that you have encountered that other frontline workers might encounter in their work, having to do with women in abusive situations? Christina, do you want to start?
Oh, well, I think the most interesting one that I had was where a patient was dying of pneumonia, the pneumonia that HIV people get. And when he had moved in with his girlfriend several months prior, he threw all his meds away, quit taking them because he didn't want her to find out. And, our hands were tied. We could not divulge to her, and they had been having unprotected sex. So we could not divulge to her that she had been put at risk and needed to get herself tested. And most of the work that I did on that case was staff support because, needless to say, the staff were frustrated, they were angry. So there's can also in these violent episodes, there can also be a health component, not just the physical, battery that takes place, but if there's a history of cheating, at some point we need to find a way to suggest that they get tested for STDs. And she was just adamant that this fellow was a good man. He, just, couldn't sing his praises enough. And, she was in, it was a new relationship. They just moved in, and it was just impossible for her to believe that, he would do anything to jeopardize her or her child. And I don't know, that was one of the hardest ones that I was involved with. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the elder woman who didn't want to return to her son?
Oh yeah, we had a patient with elderly lady who was quite upset, so I was asked to go visit her. And as we were talking, every so often, out of nowhere, she'd just say, "What? He won't hurt me, would he? You don't think he would hurt me, do you?" And that was just like such a red flag for me. So after I ended the visit, I found the unit social worker, explained what had happened, what had been said, and we went ahead and filled out the paperwork, turned it into the authorities, and she was discharged to a care home. She was not sent home with her son. So hopefully, she had a bit of a better life as a result.
Right.
But I was just so grateful that I was able to recognize that plea for help and take it to somebody who affirmed that yes, what I was hearing was a red flag and correct, and then helped me. I'd never filled out the paperwork before, so she was very gracious to take time out of her busy schedule and help me fill out the paperwork. So
Definitely teamwork.
yes, and that's one of the things I liked about working in the hospital was that the teamwork.
Right. Pam, could you share a story or two?
Sure. And I'm just trying to think of things that, people are going to face, especially if they're not giving trauma specific services, but they're encountering the targets of abuse, in the course of other work. Our role becomes one of mainly referral, but also being a knowledgeable supporter. So not someone who's necessarily directly addressing the abuse, but being a knowledgeable, non-harming supporter. And the thing about that connects up with what I was saying before about just giving options. So instead of telling someone what to do and having a program or an agenda in mind, we just remain open-ended to the self-determination of people who are dealing with abuse, because we don't want to replicate abuse, frankly. We don't want to be another person telling her what to do, right? Because she's already got that, usually. She's already got someone coercive or controlling. So we don't want to replicate that. So we want to respect people's choices and information. And that gets really hard when we, can see the trajectory of this, and we can see that her partner is going to continue to be a risk for violence, and this is going to continue to be an unsafe situation. And yet, often someone can't really put together the fact that they love someone, but that person's also unsafe. So as you've already said in your videos, Kate, people return multiple times, or they never leave for various reasons. So I think, I think about a project I did years ago, and it was about family court mediation, where couples where there was abuse were nevertheless being channeled into face-to-face mediation. This is re-traumatizing for most abuse victims. And I had a very negative response to mediation, obviously, from the targets of abuse who felt they were still being intimidated. But I remember interviewing one woman who was really just at the beginning of a journey of waking up to the magnitude of the abuse in her relationship. And her main focus was not her own healing. Her main focus was not even her own safety. It was getting help for him. Like, I want to do mediation. I want him to get help. I want there to be a peaceful, supportive solution to this. And already having a lot of expertise by that point, because of the risk factors in his pattern of behavior, you know, I knew fundamentally that was not in the cards for him. And so, you know, seeing her just desperately prioritizing some kind of healing for him in a way, you know, that isn't really fact-based about what's going on. And it's very, very hard to witness. But one of the things that helps me with the vicarious trauma of watching that is to think about people's lifelong journey. You know, working with abuse is not something that happens on a dime. You know, we're talking about taking out very deep internalized messages, sometimes earlier traumas from childhood, carrying forward into the traumatic situation with a relationship. This is lifelong inner work. So keeping that big perspective helps me not feel extreme wear and tear by watching women at an earlier point where they're just really figuring out the magnitude of the situation, just coming to realism about hopes and what's necessary to really be safe and for change to take place, developing that kind of big, broad view so that I'm less vicariously traumatized.
Boy, you've made a couple of really important points there that I'd like to follow up on. I'm not sure we've got time to really get into them in any depth. We might have to talk about another seminar. But you talked about the therapists themselves being traumatized. And that, I think, is a really, really important thing that we should dive into a little bit more. What would you say to a frontline worker to help to, I mean, you've already given us a couple of ideas, but is there anything else that you would tell a frontline worker about how to approach this kind of clientele and to approach their own work, I guess, so that they don't get traumatized?
Well, I would say that it's an organizational responsibility, that actually the best protection against vicarious trauma is to be in an environment where there's collective responsibility. So we're sharing the burden. We have someone to debrief with very easily and accessibly for us. We're with colleagues and with organized responses in the community, so that we're not bearing this alone. We're not bearing our own wellness as therapists completely alone, and we're not bearing the responsibility for helping make abuse survivors safe alone either. So that's kind of a threshold issue, is to see this as an organizational and a professional responsibility issue, not just a personal wellness issue, but understanding the collectivity takes some of that burden off us.
Right.
Yeah, and there's so much to say, but I'm sure you both have things you could say too about that, and I'm curious what you would say too.
Well, one of the things I can say is that working as I do alone, and without the backing, I mean, I'm self-employed, I have my own private practice, without the backing of an organization can sometimes be really lonely. And it can sometimes be scary, you know, like if I'm meeting a client for the first time, especially a male client, and I don't know anything about this person. I don't even have a panic button in my office. And if I did have one, there'd be nobody to answer it. So that's one of the things that concerns me from time to time. Fortunately, in my career, I think I've only encountered 2 people that actually scared me. And I think I managed to deal with that fairly well. In one case by just pretending I was fine and everything was cool and reflecting it back to the patient, and he gradually sort of dropped his antagonistic and intimidating behavior. And then there was another couple in which the man and the woman came in together, and it was definitely an abusive relationship. And she was trying last ditch anything that might tell her whether or not this was a relationship that was worth keeping, or if she should do something different about it. And when he realized that he wasn't going to be able to bowl both her and me over, he stomped around, and it was very physical and very loud and very big in the office. And that was a little scary. So I just smiled sweetly and talked about how we would get together later and ushered him out the door, but it's a little frightening. So I really hear what you're saying about having an organization to back you up. There are times when I wish I did. There's other times when I'm really glad that I'm independent, because I can do this kind of thing, for example, without having to ask permission from an organization to do something that might not necessarily be part of their political mandate, right? So I enjoy the freedom. I don't think I'd give it up. I think I kind of digressed a little bit from your question, but Christina, what do you think?
Well, in the hospital, we had a couple of things we would do. We would twice yearly do a blessing of the hands. And that was a time to remind staff that there is something spiritual about what they do, and they don't do it alone, not just physically alone, but there's something greater than us surrounding and supporting them.
Mm-hmm.
We also, after traumatic event in the ER or the trauma base, we would also do some sort of a debriefing. Would depend on what had happened and who was involved. We would design it for that particular incident. My door was always open to staff to come in and cry, yell, whatever they needed to do at the moment to kind of decompress and get through the rest of their day. I kind of did a ministry of hugs to my staff. They all knew if they needed a hug, they could find me and they would get one. So those were ways that I could, stopgap ways I could walk alongside my staff. I also encouraged people. We had an EAP program. I strongly encouraged them to utilize that resource. They would get a certain number of free visits paid for by the hospital. I myself used it because I needed a place to go and talk about some of the things that I saw and witnessed in a confidential manner. And I was very grateful for that time and space too. So those were the types of things that we would do in the hospital to accompany staff who witnessed these things. And then for the patients themselves, if they wanted me to pray with them, I always asked them what they would want included in their prayer. So empowering them in that process rather than me just thinking I know what's best for them and blurting out something. Yeah, that would be offhand. That would be I think the best things I could offer in the short term.
Okay, thanks. One of the things that you both alluded to is how difficult, how challenging it is for a woman to actually end abuse or to actually leave an abusive relationship. I think we all know that there are many factors involved there. So I'd be curious to hear from both of you what you have encountered. What do you think are some of the factors that make it so hard for a woman to actually leave an abuser? Pam, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, well, there's so many. And for some women with certain abusers, leaving actually makes things more dangerous for her, because as we know statistically, immediately after leaving certain abusers, certain subgroups of abusers, that's the highest time for those abusers to become murderers of their partners. So, we can have a very real sense that our lives are in danger if we leave. So that's maybe on an extreme end of why some people don't leave. But I think it's an important factor to understand that actually leaving does not guarantee safety in a subset of abusers. So that's important to realize. Another reason that women don't leave is because it can seem extremely daunting to navigate, especially with children, a sudden plunge into poverty. And women may already be living in poverty with an abuser, or they may not, but often leaving an abuser means a real plunge in resources. So that can seem too daunting, especially with children. Also, women might feel they have more control and more ability to protect their children from an abuser who is also abusive to the children if she's on site all the time, as opposed to sharing custody where he has them unsupervised for long periods of time. Also, those internalized myths or messages that we are responsible for the peace and emotional wellness of the entire family, and that, partnership is death till we part, and carrying that burden of feeling like that's part of our role as a person, especially as a woman, to like keep it together no matter what, taking that responsibility. Hopes for change, also realistic or unrealistic. We can, be hoping for change in the abuser's behavior. We may be making ourselves too responsible for that. Those are a few of the reasons, and there's more too.
No, there's tons. Christine, what have you encountered?
Well, as you know, there's a very conservative part of Christianity that believes marriage is for life and you don't leave and whatever. And they talk about the man being over the woman, blah blah blah. So for people that are prone to think like that, I'd like to remind them that if you're going to take the Bible, the biblical story of creation, Eve was created from Adam's rib. That to me says partners are meant to walk side by side as equals. And anything that destroys and undermines that equality of partnership is wrong. There is no justification for it. And if the abusing partner can't see his way clear to get the help he needs to reestablish that, then I think it's incumbent upon the woman to leave to protect herself. Nothing in the Bible says she has to sacrifice herself up to and including loss of life to maintain a marriage. It's a covenant, and it's meant to enhance both individuals, not destroy one at the hands of the other. So just get that little subject over and done with. I think one thing I've noticed, oftentimes society is very good at telling men they can be and do anything they want. We're not so much good at giving that message to women. And I think to the extent that women can be encouraged to pursue what they're good at, their interests, to develop those gifts and talents, in such a way too that they can support themselves and be financially independent if they need to be. In the process of doing that, they learn they're competent. They learn they can have control and agency over their life. Might make it more difficult for then an abuser to come in and undermine them. So I think society has a long way to go in promoting women as fully autonomous, competent, capable people who can do anything they put their mind to. So that, and I don't know, I don't know how you rectify that. I guess tiny steps, I don't know, but I think it's an issue that society needs to address, and parents too. I mean, how many times do we see it that there's only money for one kid to go to school and they'll pick the dumb son over the bright daughter? It's like, seriously, the son, maybe his skill set lies going through a trade school. So match that. But why do you just automatically, because it's a daughter, deny her the access to the money for an education.
Right.
I don't get that, but that's just me. Sorry, I digress. Okay.
It seems, for those of us who are a little long in the tooth and white in the hair, that we've been working politically and socially and medically to try and turn around the things that we've all just talked about in our society that are not equitable. And it's a little frustrating to me that we're bloody well still having to do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the people who commented on the videos that I posted on YouTube and on Facebook was a man who said, hold on a second here, there are men who are abused by women as well, and the dynamics are pretty much the same. Have either of you ever encountered men who are stuck in abusive relationships, and would you agree that their experience is pretty similar?
Offhand, I'm not aware. That's not to say I haven't. I just right now I can't think of something, but I guess, abuse is abuse. So, and the violence cycle would be the same. If the messages from the woman or the gay partner to the man have been the same as undermining their self-esteem, their sense of agency, then I get there would be a lot of similarities, I would think.
Pam, have you encountered this?
Yeah, sure. I have worked with men in my private practice who were targeted for abuse by a partner. For sure, absolutely. Are the patterns of abusers, do they show a lot of overlap? Yes, they do, regardless of the gender of the person doing the abuse. Or I'd say some of the differences do come in, have to do with internalized ideas of femininity and masculinity determining our choices in response to abuse. And also where are we socially situated, and that's always going to have an influence about how we experience everything, including how we experience abuse. So, if we're white and we're not experiencing racism, if we have money and resources, we're not experiencing poverty, if we are have many abilities and we're not differently abled, if we are in the prime of life rather than being very young or very old, we're going to experience things, including abuse, differently. So, yes, while abuse is always unacceptable and abusers' patterns can have a lot of similarity, at the same time, our experience of that is going to be different depending on how we're socially situated, for sure.
Okay, thanks. So if you had to sum up everything you know and everything you've experienced and everything you hold dear, what would you say would be your top advice, your number one piece of advice to a frontline worker who does or may in the future be providing services of some kind to a woman who is involved in an abusive relationship? What's your top piece of advice to frontline workers? Christina?
To be a compassionate presence, to recognize that it's going to take many, many tries for her to leave, if in fact she's able to not judge her, to just create a supportive, compassionate presence around her, to give her a time out from that abusive relationship, and to recognize red flags when they come up in a conversation, and if it's outside your scope of practice, to refer on to somebody whose scope of practice it is to deal with that.
Okay, thanks. Pam?
I would echo everything Christina said. And also, you might have heard the slogan, start by believing. So, we often have a lot of internalized doubt about abuse survivors' stories and truth. So just remind ourselves, there is that kind of internalized doubt in our society. I'm going to start by believing. So taking that attitude, taking the safety risks and the magnitude of trauma impact very seriously. These are not small things. These are big, major things. And just having a healthy respect for what that person has gone through or is going through, and leave aside the judging, as Christina said, and instead think options. Don't think directives. Know your community resources so you can make swift and appropriate referrals also. I think that's really important. And then again, touching in on the vicarious trauma thing, don't feel you have to carry this by yourself when you hear harrowing details of abuse, or when you feel scared that you're not helping to create safety. Reach out to colleagues, to supervisors, to peers, and don't take this burden alone.
Okay, thank you. So you've both given me some wonderful stuff to think about and to talk about. One last question. If you could pick one thing that you wish you had known early on in your career that you didn't know then, but you do know now, what would it be? Christina?
It would be the fact that women need to take multiple, it takes them many, many tries to leave. When you're on the outside looking in and you see somebody come in and they've been battered, and you think, well, why would you put up with that? So just understanding the dynamics of what holds the victim there, that it takes a number of tries. Just being more aware of the whole situation and all the factors that play into it. Because I think it's way too easy to slip into that judgmental role. And I know I found myself on occasion doing it. Fortunately, caught myself. So, we need that internal ammunition to keep us out of that space so that we can create the space and time that somebody needs to deal with the situation. So just being aware of the dynamics of that.
Right. Okay, thanks. Pam?
Well, my choice to share today is the learning that abuse survivors are often experiencing trauma in systems that's secondary to the abuse trauma, but is often just as severe. So abuse survivors are very often experiencing betrayal. They're experiencing racism, misogyny, and all sorts of put downs and oppression through the systems that are supposed to be helping us. So sometimes we do get help from those systems, but often we don't. And again, it depends on where we're socially situated. So when I started as a white, privileged, pretty sheltered person without, direct criminalization experiences in my life, without direct involvement in my life by child protection, it took me a while to figure out that many of these systems often are inflicting severe secondary traumas on abuse survivors, and just understanding that sometimes those secondary traumas are as great or greater than the original abuse traumas.
Thank you. Boy, we've covered a lot of ground today. Thank you so much, both of you. This has been absolutely awesome. I think that CWIN's counseling, CWIN's education and CWIN's online counseling, which are two of the companies that I'm involved with, will probably do more of these seminars or symposiums or webinars, whatever you want to call them. I know this has been lots of fun. We've really just touched on a lot of things that are very important. There's so much more that could be said. There's so much more depth that could be talked about. And particularly for those of you frontline workers who are fairly new to this topic, you may be reeling a little bit now from all the information. So I just would like to tell you that there is a course coming up, an online course, starting in 2 weeks, December the 4th, 2020, if you're seeing this later, for frontline workers. It's called the Breakout Pro for Frontline Workers, How to Respond Effectively to Women in Abusive Relationships. So if you want to know more about that, if you want to explore the course content and see if it might be for you, I'll put a link in the comment section immediately below where this video is posted. If you have any comments, any questions, or anything, by all means, do get in touch. If you want to address your question to one of our guests from today, just address your question to that person and I will forward it to her. So thank you very much, you two, Christina and Pam, for being involved in this symposium. And thank you to everyone who is seeing this recording on YouTube or on Facebook or on our website. And stay tuned for more. Thanks a lot, guys. And by the way, if I'm going to turn off the recording shortly, if you guys would just stay put for a moment or two, I'd like to talk to you for a bit more.
Okay.
So goodbye, everybody.
Okay.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Christina.
Thank you, Pam. Thanks, Kate. And the course is fabulous. I really encourage frontline people to take it.
Oh, thank you for that plug.